Welcome to the Design Build Institute of America's Design Build Delivers podcast. I'm Kim Wright at DBIA's national headquarters. The ability to endure, that's not only a human ambition, but also vital to our communities and the infrastructure that supports them. For design build teams working collaboratively to deliver innovative projects, delivering resiliency is a critical part of their work. So today's conversation is all about things related to resilient projects, from the basics of defining what that really means to the technology that can help projects succeed. DBIA's BDC Director Brian Skripak will lead today's discussion with Ryan Kolker, Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council, and USCAD's Director of Innovation, Troy Gates. But before we get started, DBIA offers our special thanks to USCAD for partnering with us to bring you this year's episodes of Design Build Delivers. Now to Brian Skripak, who will kick off today's conversation on resiliency.
Really excited for this conversation today to talk about resiliency. But before we get started, Brian, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your role at the International Code Council?
Sure, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I'm Ryan Kolker, Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council, where I direct our Center of Focus on Energy Resilience and Innovation, really getting to look across the industry at some of the exciting things that are going on in the resilience, energy efficiency space, but also looking at tools like offsite construction, the digital transformation of codes and the construction process. And then I also serve as Executive Director for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, which is looking at how communities can advance their resilience through benchmarking and planning processes.
Excellent, thanks. It's great to have you here today. And Troy, can you give us an introduction on yourself and your role at USCAD?
Sure, I'm the Director of Innovation here at USCAD. I have about 20 plus years of experience in implementing technologies into AECO companies focused around BIM, design technologies, construction technologies. And recently, even more important is around ownership and owners and how they use technology to reap the benefits of those projects that are being built for them.
Excellent, thank you. So I guess just to really get the conversation started, I think, Ryan, a definition of resiliency is a good place to start, because I think that word is one that can have different meanings to different people. Much like here at DBIA, we talk about design build, but really focus on design build done right. I know I'm spending a lot of my time really level setting the terminology virtual design and construction throughout our membership as well. So I think resiliency is very similar in that context. So it'd be great if you could start by giving us your definition of that.
Yeah, so resilience is really about the opportunity or the planning to address current and future hazard conditions. And those hazards can certainly reflect either sort of shocks or stresses that we see, relative to communities. So, shocks are the things that we sort of generally jump to when we talk about, sort of resilience or hazards, your earthquakes, your hurricanes, tornado events, those sorts of things. But there's also this emerging interest in some of the stresses that are maybe slower developing. So we can think about sort of climate risks around sea level rise, for instance, or even social risks around sort of homelessness, or, if a major employer in a community leaves, sort of what impact does that have on the community? And so really being sort of holistic to look at sort of all the aspects of communities and assuring that we have the plans and processes in place to continue to thrive and sort of address any sort of hazards that a community may face.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's, and I ask about the definition at first because I think sometimes there's a little hesitancy in that description, or a little too much of a direct comparison between resiliency and sustainability. While I think there's obviously some connections there, they still have that different focus. So from that perspective, how would you maybe demystify that one equates to the other for the purposes of making sure that we're all on the same page?
Yeah, so they're definitely highly related, and I would almost think that sort of sustainability is maybe a subset of sort of the broader concept of resilience. So sustainability is thinking about sort of the ability of a building, a material to continue to sustain the sort of environmental needs of an occupant or a community. And so, if you think about sort of a broad definition of resilience, sort of the health, the environmental welfare of occupants is certainly sort of a subset of advancing, sort of those resilience initiatives.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good to be able to kind of break that down. I think the other key, looking at resiliency versus sustainability, you also talked about the social impacts of that. And that's another much broader, inclusive aspect to this idea that we're talking about. Can you maybe go into that a little bit more and what some of those stresses are and some of the impacts that those are providing as it relates to the social aspects?
Yeah, so I can give you a pretty good example. The Code Council develops the International Energy Conservation Code, which focuses on energy efficiency of buildings. And really, the sort of vast majority of folks, when they think about an energy code, just think about sort of energy bills or sort of operational type of energy, kilowatt hours, for instance. But we've actually done some activities on sort of how do you dive into additional resilience benefits that an energy code provides. So on the social side, thinking about the amount of money that low and moderate income households spend on their utility bills is disproportionately higher. So sort of the average American spends about 6%, maybe even less, on energy bills every month. But low and moderate income households, it can be up to 30%. And so if you think about sort of what impact that has on social resilience and being able to sort of avoid the stresses of decision making on do you turn on the heat or do you get groceries, is sort of a social challenge. The other thing that we've been looking at relative to resilience and energy efficiency is concepts of things like passive survivability. So if the grid goes down because of a hazard event or because of sort of extreme heat or extreme cold events, that people can sort of remain in their buildings longer because they've made that energy efficiency investment, and then they don't have to go to a shelter or a cooling station, and that relieves sort of the pressures on the community as well.
Yeah, that's I think that aspect of it is another interesting component, because then you really start looking at the interconnectivity of all of these different ideas that our society's dealing with, right? It's not just energy. It's not, it becomes the community aspect of it, the social aspect, the performance aspect. You talked proactive and reactive, which are a lot of different things that really start to come into play. So this idea of it not just really being an individual silo, I think is kind of important. So you kind of hit on that a little bit, where it's this cross-pollination of things. And, again, relating that back to design build, we talk about collaboration, how do the design teams and the build teams work together to meet these larger performance goals? And it's not a silver bullet, right? There's no one project team member that has all of the answers. It's taking advantage of a collective expertise and bringing all these right partners in at the right time to be able to deliver those performance goals that our owners are setting for us. And resiliency seems to have a very similar foundation as you're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it perfectly, that it does require a holistic approach with various different aspects and expertise, and being able to sort of bring folks together to really identify the best path forward.
Yeah. So one of the other things you mentioned was, and we just talked about this, reactive versus proactive. Proactive is something that becomes extremely critical in the nature of a hazard or a major climate event or things like that. What are you seeing at the International Code Council to really focus on the proactive aspect of it instead of being in that reactive environment. We've, unfortunately had way too many, major climate hazards that have occurred recently. How do we start to work? What is your organization doing to help us all become more aware and proactive around avoiding these in the future?
Yeah, so as you recognize, we're certainly seeing an increase in the number and intensity of hazard events, and really sort of recognizing the way the codes and standards and even the design process sort of addresses risk is it's currently backward looking. So we're building buildings into the future sort of based off of what our past experience is, but we know that that's not going to be sort of the case that a building will face over the next 50 or 100 years. And so we're actually working on developing strategies to incorporate future focused climate risk in codes and standards in the design process. So working with federal agencies like NOAA and NASA and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, along with sort of other standards and code writing organizations, including American Society of Civil Engineers, AIA, ASHRAE, and others, to sort of figure out sort of what is this strategy. And then it's also sort of an international challenge as well. So we're working with code development organizations in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to really plot out sort of what is the path forward, what are the research needs, how do we use climate data today, and sort of what are the strategies that we could effectively deploy to address sort of climate resilience issues into the future. And so we actually expect to have an international resilience guideline available in November, which sort of provides that framework or principles that can really help drive progress in this space.
Are you interested in sustainable design and construction practices but concerned about profitability? USCAD, a Vin0 company, helps forward-thinking ENR top-ranked AEC firms mitigate risk and drive profit through digitalization using Autodesk AEC technology. To learn more, contact uscad.com/DBIA for a free 30-minute consultation. That's uscad.com/DBIA.
So I think one of the things that'll be kind of near and dear to my heart on the technology side is, we talk about proactive approaches, right? And how do we include that in the design process and planning? Troy, where do you see technology playing into this? And, what are you currently seeing on the horizon at USCAD that's going to allow us as architects and engineers and planners and developers to really be at the forefront of thinking about this as we design the future of the built environment?
There's really a couple of things that are really trending in the industry currently. The first one is just really around a fully encompassing digitalization of the entire project process. Things like CAD and BIM were always great because that took a big piece of the project, but there's a lot of other efforts around projects. And that digitalization is getting more and more traction to where it reduces the amount of carbon emissions, the less that you're running, all these different platforms and systems and using paper and things like that. So there is this big trend to start doing that. And what it's leading into is it's making data king in these projects. And so companies now are having to work together to exchange that data. So the other trend that we're really seeing, even over the last 5 years, is open source and community. And you mentioned that already. Community is a big part of our industry now as far as the companies in there. And those communities now are starting to work together to build better platforms and better tools to enable the design teams to be better, to the contractors to be better. So all that is working together, but also using that data to be more informed and work together and sharing that data.
Mm-hmm. What about one of the other big buzzwords that we hear in the industry is this idea of a digital twin. We know that owners are doing a lot more in trying to understand how they consume technology being used by design and construction teams for their future operations planning. How does that word digital twin, if you want to I guess I'll challenge you to give us a good definition of that, of how you define that at US CAD, and talk about what the impact of that is, and really how it relates to this proactive approach to resiliency.
Yeah, so digital twin is still something that's being defined in the industry. There are different, I wouldn't even call them factions, but maybe factions of the industry that are trying to come up with what is digital twins. But in essence, from our point of view, it's using technology to build an actual digital version of the end result of that building or that infrastructure that mirrors it. And it's not at handover that's being built. It's not a final requirement. It's living in that it starts from day one, and you start building out a model. And it's not your typical model. It's not a 3D model. It's a model of data. So whether it's just a database to start from or an actual 3D model, it doesn't really matter. It's really about building what that building or that infrastructure will look like, but doing it in parallel with design, with the construction, and then at handover, you have an actual built project and a digital version of that project. Then that digital twin continues to live on during ownership and operations, and you can start connecting things like IoTs and sensors to start integrating into that digital twin so that it continues to live. If you're turning up the heat or turning down the heat, that can also be affected in the digital twin, so you can see the results of what's going to happen in your physical building. So digital twin still has quite a bit to go for it to be fully defined and for technologies to be built for it, but it is front of mind with this owner concept of owners really wanting to drive what their project processes and deliverables look like. And they really are putting that pressure on these contractors and design teams to live up to what they want and what they expect, where in the past it was always design team knows best, contractor knows best. Now the owners are really starting to drive what's best for them.
So on the owner side, you're really seeing that as a way to calibrate the performance of their building back to the design intent that was originally set forth. So they're going to see those pretty immediately, see any discrepancies in performance. And with that idea of IoT and sensors, being able to re-simulate, what do I need to do? Which dial do I need to turn to bring it back within that, minimal variation that they need to see that optimized performance?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one really interesting opportunity that digital twins will likely provide into the future is sort of that scenario type planning. If we think about sort of the climate risks into the future, we know they'll be different, but we don't know exactly sort of what those risks will be at a particular project level. And so being able to sort of understand how your building is functioning today and maybe what, sort of different scenarios may come up into the future, being able to sort of run models based off of, your digital twins to sort of figure out, when do I have a decision point to upgrade my stormwater system or those sorts of things. So I think that's really a huge opportunity we'll see in the future.
So I guess for both Ryan and Troy to even expand upon that, we're talking about it in one context where almost at a micro level of an individual building. Now let's go to a macro level, right? We're talking about communities and a much broader aspect. How is the role of, not just BIM playing in that, but, taking it out to the next level of GIS, right? Now you have a building within a community, within a larger ecosystem, within a city and state. What are you seeing there? How is that impact? Because I think that's always an interesting, a lot of times we get stuck in a building and what happens up to 5 feet outside of it, right? But then, we lose context of the larger image, and certainly that's something that's going to play into these resiliency issues that we're dealing with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's funny, when BIM really first started taking off, prior to that in my career, I was actually doing GIS during the 90s. And when BIM came around, I was like, hey, this is just GIS, but on a micro level, at a building level. So they are very in tune with each other, and they really are doing the same thing, which is it's data. It's really about the data, because you can use that data at that more macro level of GIS to really, start looking at how does a community be impacted? How does a campus, or even how does a large organization that has buildings across the country, they can actually start measuring that and looking at it for all the different parts of the climate in the different parts of the country, or impacts on those individual communities. So you are looking at a much bigger scale of data.
Yeah, I mean, from sort of the perspective of the Alliance for National and Community Resilience and its work, I mentioned the development of community resilience benchmarks. So we identified 19 different community functions that sort of impact communities every day, but also influence their resilience. And so if we were just to focus on sort of one community function, say buildings, that's certainly a valuable piece of the community, but those buildings are ultimately connected to a water system, an energy grid, transportation networks, even sort of other services that are provided from buildings. So healthcare, schools, cultural resources. And so being able to sort of look holistically around sort of where are your vulnerabilities in a community, and where maybe you should make investments on those particular areas. We typically say a community is only as resilient as its weakest link. And if you're over investing in one area and under investing in another, you're not really creating sort of that community level resilience. And so having tools like GIS can really help support sort of the visualization of where those sort of weak links are, but also sort of communicate effectively to folks that maybe aren't sort of ingrained in sort of our buildings area of focus.
So as you talk about ideas of overinvestment and underinvestment, making sure that we are looking holistically, what are the biggest opportunities that we're taking advantage of right now? Where are we seeing the biggest ROIs? And when you look into the future, where are the areas that we're maybe not focusing on right now that are the next challenges that we really need to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of lots of challenges, and I think they vary, community by community. I think we've seen improvements in things like building codes, both from sort of structural safety, but also energy efficiency, and those are sort of things that have evolved over time, and we're continuing to make progress on. I think for the buildings industry in particular, I think one of the sort of emerging challenges is the materials we use and the impacts that they have on climate change. And so, how do we really understand, what energy and greenhouse gas emissions are associated with different materials? But then at the same time, how do we really understand the various different services that those materials perform? And so how do we balance sort of that resilience and sustainability and figure out sort of what's the best sort of delivery for a building, and then for the community at large?
Yeah, I think that kind of idea of talking, materials, greenhouse gases really starts to pull into a larger strategy. We hear people talk a lot about net zero buildings, and it is a full life cycle approach to that. And you have to go back all the way to the individual materials that you're talking about, that how are those being procured, where are they coming from, what's their life cycle, what off-gassing is there, all of that. I think that's a kind of another new portion of that strategy that people are talking about, and maybe they don't think about, because it gets down to a granular level where materials can be so critical to a performance in a bigger ecosystem that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we talked about the important role of, various different folks within the design and construction process. I think, in the future, we may even see, sort of a materials or even, sort of an enhanced sustainability sort of role on, design and construction teams. So I think that's important, but also, having the tools to help support sort of the ability to understand the impacts that various different choices have. And I think certainly seeing the digital tools that we have today and those that are emerging into the future, I think will be sort of really helpful to help support that process as well.
Troy, are there any tools that come to top of mind that support that, from a material life cycle approach and carbon emission quantification? What are you seeing out there that's contributing to, that's allowing design teams and builders and owners start to quantify that and plan ahead?
Yeah, there are some open source initiatives going on right now. Not really sure off the top of my head what the names of them are, but there are some open source initiatives right now from some design and contracting companies that are working together to build tools that allow you to evaluate your design and test it against carbon emissions to see what your results really are, and actually offers up recommendations on what you can change to lower your carbon emission. And outside of a specific tool like that, there are companies that are changing how they use local resources in how they actually control the climate within their buildings. We have an owner that we work with that's a technology company that builds data centers. And they've actually changed how they cool their data centers to reduce the amount of water that they're using in that local area by changing the process. Instead of using large volumes of water in a chilling tower and then using that to make your air colder to blow into your data centers, they're reversing it. They're using air to cool a smaller amount of water and then using that water to re-cool the air and push that into their data center. And I believe they've reduced their water usage by like 20% per data center. So changes in how we do things is really starting to impact the amount of resources that we use.
That's pretty exciting to hear an example of how innovation's driving that and people rethinking their processes to do things in a different way and have those opportunities. Ryan, do you have any other kind of examples or case studies like that you can share of how an owners change their process like that?
Maybe not a specific process, but folks that are thinking sort of more holistically around, resilience and sustainability and really sort of embedding it into their processes. And the example comes to mind of Target Corporation. So, they just actually opened their first zero energy store in California, really, looking at opportunities to, continue to push, for sustainability. At the same time, they're very much involved in the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, sort of recognizing their role as sort of a center of communities, both sort of providing goods and services for the community, but also really the welfare of their employees or team members. And so having that conversation at a community level and going beyond just sort of their individual store, but thinking about how to influence the long-term, resilience of the community, and really, also working, sort of across the sort of retailer segment to really get away from, sort of these, rash responses to disasters where, sort of everybody decides it's, they're going to truck in water and generators and sort of all of this, but thinking about sort of a more, coordinated approach to assure that, communities can get back up and running quickly.
Excellent. Any last thoughts? Any last perspectives that you have, or maybe challenges to the audience that you have to help out on these larger initiatives?
I mean, one other area that we've been focusing a lot on is opportunities to use offsite construction to address, challenges, sustainability challenges through, sort of material usage, workforce challenges, which I know is a huge one for the industry, but also looking at sort of the availability and affordability of housing, particularly multifamily, and being able to sort of stand up projects quicker. And then, thinking about sort of how, as Troy mentioned, sort of this complete, sort of digital process from, sort of early design, through fabrication can really be leveraged to address many of these challenges that we've talked about. So I think that's another exciting area that I'm involved in.
Excellent. Troy, what about you?
Yeah, I would just say, it's no single company can tackle this on their own, right? it really requires partnerships. It requires working together and really being innovative together. And I think we're really seeing that, owners are teaming up with contractors and working together to build a plan and build a better way to do things. It's not just the contractor themselves. It's not just the owner or the design team by themselves. It really takes the community in that project to build things together. And I think to continue moving us forward, it branches out from individual projects into an industry. So continuing that sharing of data, that open source mindset, and just working together to tackle it.
Yeah, I think I said this idea of resiliency, which is great for both of you to be able to share your expertise on that. And these larger ideas are, again, like we said at the beginning, it's interesting as the conversation went on. It's about sharing of information, sharing of data, sharing of everything, that collaborative environment, and taking advantage of the expertise that each individual party brings to this challenge. It is critical for us to solve these issues that we're going to continue to have as we move forward. If we don't start to address them, it's going to become worse and worse. So the opportunity for us to look at that, not all that dissimilar from design build, collaboration, teaming, getting on the same page early, these are all huge impacts for us to be able to, take advantage of how we transform the built environment as we move forward into the future.
Thanks again to Brian, Troy, and Ryan for joining us. We hope you'll join US CAD and DBIA on June 16th at 11 a.m. to noon Pacific Time for a live webinar and panel discussion on leveraging the digital transformation in construction. We also have some resources we'd like to share to help you dig a little deeper into delivering resilient projects. Get details on the webinar, plus links to this episode's resources in our show notes at dbia.org/podcasts. And again, thank you to US CAD for their support of Design Build Delivers. Find out more at uscad.com/DBIA.